need to admit something about my job. For 11 years, I've designed foundations for buildings in New Orleans, a city built on soft alluvial soil that never stops settling, sinking measurably every single year under the combined weight of its own geology and its own history of drained wetlands. My entire professional identity has formed around one quiet, hard-won belief. Building on genuinely bad ground always means signing up for an endless, ongoing fight. You shore a structure up, you monitor it, you shore it up again a few years later, and you never get to consider the problem finished because the ground itself refuses to finish moving. I've built a career on treating that endless maintenance relationship as simply the honest cost of building anywhere the earth wasn't generous enough to make easy. I've said as much, more than once, to younger engineers on my team who wanted to believe a clever enough design could make the ground stop being a problem permanently. And I've generally believed I was doing them a favor by correcting that optimism early. Then my colleague Rashid called me about a tower. Rashid Al-Mazrouei is a structural engineer in Dubai, part of the team that has spent years running the real-time structural health monitoring program inside the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building on Earth, a role he'd fallen into almost by accident early in his career and had never once considered leaving since. We met at an international conference on tall building engineering a few years back. One of those events where the technical sessions matter less than the long dinners afterward, where people actually admit what keeps them up at night professionally, conversations that tend to be far more useful than anything presented from a podium. He called on a weekday evening, sounding more energized than his usual careful, measured tone, and asked if I could come see the monitoring center in person. Not as a tourist, but as someone who might actually understand what he was about to show me. I asked him, honestly, what a super tall tower in the middle of a desert could possibly teach a geotechnical engineer who spends her career fighting soft ground in a city that's slowly sinking into a river delta, a question I meant less as a challenge than as genuine, slightly tired curiosity after a long week at the office. He told me, in the tone of someone who has been waiting for exactly this question, that the Burj Khalifa stands on 40 meters of loose sand and still barely moves, and that the reason has almost nothing to do with luck and almost everything to do with a decision his team made years before a single pile was ever driven into the ground, a decision he clearly thought I'd appreciate more than most people he could have called instead. I booked a flight 2 weeks later. I told my firm I was attending an international structural monitoring exchange, which was technically true, and left out how skeptical I still was that anything built in a desert could genuinely change how I thought about the specific, unglamorous, permanent battle I fight every day against soft Louisiana clay. On the long flight across the Atlantic, I found myself pulling up photos of a project I'd worked on the previous year. A mid-rise building whose foundation had already needed one round of remedial work less than 5 years after completion, and tried, without much success, to imagine what it would feel like to hand a client a foundation and genuinely mean it when I told them it was finished. I had spent 11 years assuming that any serious engineering relationship with bad ground was necessarily an ongoing one, a problem you manage rather than a problem you solve. I did not yet understand how completely that assumption was about to be challenged, and I suspect, looking back, that Rashid already knew exactly how the week was going to unfold before I'd even boarded the plane. Dubai meets you first as a genuine, immediate contradiction, and Rashid made sure I understood that contradiction before he showed me anything else at all. Less than a lifetime ago, the entire area was open desert, punishing heat, and near total silence. Home to Bedouin communities who had survived there for centuries with almost nothing beyond an intimate, practical knowledge of the land itself. Rashid drove me out past the edge of the city on my first full day specifically to stand in that same desert, dunes rolling toward the horizon in every direction, the noise of the city falling away almost completely within a few minutes of leaving the last paved road behind. We sat on the sand as the lights started to shift toward evening, and Rashid told me a story about his own family that reframed the entire trip before it had really begun. His grandfather had worked as a pearl diver before the oil economy transformed the region. Diving without any equipment beyond a nose clip and a weighted rope, spending months at sea each year in crews that dove for hours a day in dangerous conditions for a chance at a handful of natural pearls that might, on a good season, provide enough income to last the family through the following year. An entire regional economy had been built on that industry for generations, going back centuries. The Gulf's natural pearl beds among the richest in the world. Then, almost overnight in the 1930s, Japanese cultured pearls flooded the global market, technologically produced at a fraction of the cost and, crucially, nearly indistinguishable in quality from the wild variety divers here had spent their lives risking their bodies to harvest. The natural pearl trade collapsed within a matter of years, not decades, and the region spent a genuinely hard stretch of economic hardship afterward. Well before oil was ever discovered here, families like Rashid's rebuilding their livelihoods from something close to nothing. That detail doesn't fit neatly into the version of Dubai's story most visitors arrive already believing, the one where extraordinary wealth simply appeared out of nowhere rather than following an earlier, harder chapter most people never hear about, a chapter Rashid clearly thought was worth me understanding before I set foot anywhere near a skyscraper. We drove back toward the city as the light started to change, and the skyline appeared gradually rather than all at once, towers rising out of heat shimmer on the horizon long before any other sign of urban development became visible. Rashid told me that was deliberate. In a sense, the city's rapid growth over the past few decades has consistently prioritized height and visual impact, specifically because Dubai's entire modern economic strategy depends on being seen, on generating the kind of unmistakable image that draws investment, tourism, and international attention to a country with comparatively modest oil reserves that leadership recognized decades ago would eventually run out. Standing at the base of the Burj Khalifa that evening, craning my neck upward until the top of the tower genuinely disappeared into haze rather than resolving into a visible point, I understood the strategy instinctively even before Rashid finished explaining it. You cannot look at that building and not immediately want to understand how it's possible. The next morning, Rashid took me inside, not to the observation decks most visitors see, but to the building's mechanical and monitoring floors, where the actual engineering answer to my questions started to take shape. He explained that the tower's foundation had to solve a problem most super tall buildings never have to face in combination. Dubai's soil consists of roughly 40 meters of loose, weak sand and interbedded siltstone, sitting above bedrock, saturated with groundwater aggressive enough to corrode unprotected steel and concrete over time. Engineers designed a piled raft foundation to address it. Nearly 200 reinforced concrete piles, each about 1.5 meters in diameter, driven between 43 and 50 meters deep through that sand layer to reach more competent ground below, topped by a raft slab of reinforced concrete nearly 4 meters thick. Engineered to spread the tower's roughly 500,000 metric tons of weight evenly enough that no single section of ground beneath it bears more than it can handle. The raft itself was poured in 4 separate stages, specifically to control the heat generated by curing concrete at that volume, mixed with ice and poured at night during Dubai's punishing summer heat to keep the concrete from setting too quickly and cracking under thermal stress before it had fully cured. Rashid told me the piles alone required an extensive, dedicated load testing program before construction even started. Individual piles tested under loads exceeding 60 meganewtons to confirm the design's predicted settlement behavior actually matched reality before a single one of the real, permanent piles went into the ground beneath the tower itself, a level of upfront verification I genuinely wished more of my own clients were willing to pay for. I was wrong about something specific, standing on that mechanical floor listening to Rashid walk through the numbers. I'd assumed, walking into the building, that a foundation this massive was simply an act of engineering excess, more concrete and more piles thrown at the problem until the ground had no choice but to comply. What Rashid was actually describing was closer to the opposite, an unusually precise, front-loaded solution designed with enough care at the outset that the building's relationship with its own foundation could, in principle, stay largely settled, rather than requiring the kind of continuous, reactive intervention I fight for every project back home. The piles weren't overbuilt out of caution alone. They were calibrated, load-tested extensively before construction even began, engineered to a specific, predicted settlement behavior that the building's monitoring systems have since spent years quietly confirming, the actual measured settlement tracking remarkably close to what the original models had predicted more than a decade earlier. But the foundation, Rashid told me, was only half the problem. Wind was the other half, and at 828 meters, wind behaves differently than it does at any height. A conventional structural engineer typically designs for a rectangular tower that tall would face enormous, potentially catastrophic lateral wind loads, along with a phenomenon called vortex shedding, where wind moving around a tall, uniform structure creates alternating pockets of low pressure that can set a building oscillating dangerously if the structure's shape doesn't actively work to prevent it. A resonance effect that has been implicated in serious structural problems in other tall buildings around the world over the decades. The design team's solution was the tower's distinctive Y-shaped footprint, a central hexagonal core buttressed by 3 wings extending outward at even angles, each wing stepping back and spiraling subtly as the tower rises. A geometry the architects have said drew inspiration from the Hymenocallis flower, a desert lily whose petals radiate outward from a central stem in almost exactly the same triangular symmetry, and from the geometric patterns found in traditional Islamic architecture. That shape isn't primarily decorative. Wind tunnel testing across more than 100 different configurations confirmed that the specific stepped, spiraling geometry disrupts the wind's ability to organize itself into the kind of coordinated vortex pattern that threatens a simpler shape, reducing overall wind loads on the structure by as much as 40% compared to a conventional rectangular tower of the same height. In winds exceeding 250 kilometers an hour, the tower's peak shifts by no more than about 2 meters, a genuinely remarkable figure for a structure this tall and this exposed, and one Rashid clearly still found satisfying to say out loud even after years of working with the building. I was wrong about something else, listening to this part of the explanation. I'd assumed the tower's shape was primarily an aesthetic decision, something architects settled on for visual drama and then asked structural engineers to make work as best they could. What Rashid described was the reverse. A shape derived directly from wind engineering requirements, tested and refined specifically to solve a structural problem that also happened to result in one of the most visually striking buildings ever constructed. Form wasn't following function here in some abstract, aspirational sense. Form was function, quite literally, translated into a silhouette instantly recognizable from photographs most people have seen without ever understanding what the shape was actually doing, or that a flower had anything to do with why the building doesn't sway more violently in a strong storm. The night everything actually came into sharp, immediate focus happened on my 4th day, when Rashid arranged for me to shadow the overnight shift in the building's structural monitoring center, a room lined with screens displaying live data streams from thousands of sensors embedded throughout the tower, strain gauges, accelerometers, GPS units tracking the building's sway at various heights, settlement monitors watching the foundation's behavior in real time. All of it continuously logged and compared against the predicted performance models developed before construction ever began. The room itself was quiet in the specific way. Control rooms are quiet, low conversation, the hum of equipment, the occasional soft chime of a routine status update scrolling past on one of the screens. A strong wind system moved through the region that night, stronger and arriving faster than the forecast had indicated, gusts building well past what the monitoring team typically saw outside of the region's occasional major storms. I could feel it faintly even inside the building, a sense of pressure rather than sound, something that registered more in my ears than anywhere else. The engineer on shift that night, a man named Omar Nasser, has worked the monitoring center for close to 7 years, experienced enough to recognize immediately that this particular event sat meaningfully outside the range of routine, everyday wind loading the building handles without any special attention at all. He'd mentioned, earlier in the evening before the wind picked up, that most nights on this shift were genuinely uneventful. Hours of watching numbers stay inside their expected range. That was clearly not what this particular night was going to be. Just past 2 in the morning, one of the strain sensors on an upper mechanical floor spiked to a reading Omar hadn't personally seen logged before, a value sitting close to, though not definitively past, one of the secondary alert thresholds built into the monitoring system's design. He had perhaps 90 seconds, by the center's internal protocol, to make an initial assessment before escalating the reading to the on-call structural engineering lead. A decision that would trigger a formal review process, additional inspections, and, depending on what that review found, potentially disruptive precautionary measures affecting the building during a period when it was, as always, fully occupied. He had a decision in front of him with no fully comfortable version: escalate immediately, treating the reading as a genuine anomaly requiring senior review regardless of how it resolved, accepting the very real possibility that it would ultimately prove to be exactly the kind of expected. Within tolerance response, the building's aerodynamic design was specifically engineered to produce under unusually strong wind, a false alarm that would nonetheless consume real-time resources and attention across a wider team in the middle of the night. And that would, if it happened often enough on marginal calls, gradually erode the credibility of his own judgment within the team. Or hold, cross-referencing the reading against the dozen other sensors on the same floor and against the tower's documented wind response models, trusting his own accumulated experience, reading this exact system to distinguish a genuine outlier from an expected, if unusually strong, structural response, and risk being wrong in the other direction if this reading turned out to be the leading edge of something the models hadn't fully anticipated. Neither option was free, both carried a real cost attached to being wrong. I watched him work through it in something close to real time, pulling up the readings from the 6 nearest sensors on the same structural level, checking whether the spike was isolated to one location or distributed in the pattern the wind response models predicted for a gust of this specific strength and direction, cross-referencing the live wind data from the building's own rooftop anemometers against the strain reading's timing almost to the second. The pattern matched. The strain reading, viewed alongside the surrounding sensor data and the wind conditions at that exact moment, was consistent with the tower's buttressed core doing precisely what it had been engineered and wind tunnel tested to do, flexing, absorbing, and redistributing an unusually strong lateral load exactly the way the models built years earlier had predicted it would. Omar logged the event as an expected high wind response rather than escalating it as an anomaly, a judgment call he made using his own trained reading of the data, rather than waiting for the formal review process to reach the same conclusion on a slower timeline. I was wrong about something specific watching that unfold. I'd assumed, walking into the monitoring center, that a decision like Omar's would be primarily about trusting or doubting a single alarming number in isolation. What I actually watched was something more layered. Omar treating that one spiking reading as a question to be answered using the full surrounding context the monitoring system provided, rather than a verdict to be accepted or rejected on its own. He wasn't guessing whether the building was safe. He was reading a genuinely large, well-instrumented dataset quickly enough and with enough trained judgment to correctly interpret what a single unusual number actually meant inside a much larger pattern. Most people in that room, myself included, couldn't have assembled nearly as fast. Rashid told me afterward, once the wind had died down and the morning shift had come in, that the tower's entire monitoring philosophy was built specifically around trusting exactly that kind of trained, contextual human judgment rather than relying purely on automated threshold alarms, because thresholds alone can't distinguish between an anomaly and an expected extreme response the way an experienced engineer reading the full dataset can. Omar's log entry from that night, cross-checked the following week against the building's full data record, was later confirmed to be correct. The reading had indeed been an expected, within design tolerance response, precisely matching the wind tunnel predicted behavior for a gust of that magnitude and direction. Once that night's tension had passed, Rashid had a few more days planned before my flight home, and he used them, deliberately, to show me how far this same underlying principal problem solved carefully and thoroughly in advance, rather than fought reactively forever extended across the rest of the city. We drove out to Palm Jumeirah, the artificial, palm tree-shaped island built entirely from dredged sand and rock breakwaters in the Arabian Gulf, an engineering project that required an entirely different relationship with unstable ground than the Burj Khalifa's bedrock-anchored piles. Standing on one of the fronds, looking back at the trunk of the island and the dense line of towers along it, it was genuinely difficult to remember that all of this had been open water within living memory. The entire landform pumped into existence from millions of cubic meters of sand dredged from the seabed further offshore. The island itself sits on reclaimed land that continues to settle gradually over time, a genuinely different and ongoing engineering challenge than the tower's more fixed foundation problem, requiring continuous monitoring of both the settlement of the fill material itself and the surrounding seabed, which shifts in response to the altered currents the island's own breakwaters create. Rashid told me engineers here had accepted, from the outset, that this specific project could never be a single, front-loaded solution the way the Burj Khalifa's foundation had been. The ground itself was too new, too artificial, too actively still settling into its final form, which meant the honest engineering relationship with it looked much closer to the ongoing reactive maintenance model I practice every day in New Orleans than to the tower's more permanently resolved foundation. It struck me as a useful, humbling correction to the tidy lesson I'd been building in my head over the previous few days. Not every engineering problem in Dubai gets solved once and left alone. Some of them, like some of mine, simply have to be managed continuously, and the skill lies partly in knowing which kind of problem you're actually facing before you decide how much of your resources to spend upfront versus over time. We visited the Dubai Mall on my second-to-last full day, walking past an indoor ski slope maintaining real snow inside a building sitting in a climate that regularly pushes past 50 degrees Celsius outside, alongside aquariums, waterfalls, and a scale of retail development that genuinely does feel disorienting relative to the desert immediately outside its doors. Kids in full winter gear filed past us toward the ski slope entrance, while, through the glass wall separating it from the rest of the mall, heat visibly shimmered off the parking structure outside. Rashid pointed out that keeping snow frozen inside a desert mall requires a genuinely serious, continuously managed energy and refrigeration commitment. One more example of a system that looks effortless and permanent from the customer side of the glass while depending, underneath, on constant active intervention most visitors never think about at all. The same is true, he told me, of the city's entire water supply. Dubai depends almost completely on desalinated seawater for its drinking water, an energy-intensive process run continuously at a genuinely enormous scale simply to keep taps running in a place with essentially no natural freshwater source of its own, an infrastructure commitment so fundamental to the city's survival that most residents never think about it any more than they think about the electricity grid, despite it being, in a very real sense, the single most important piece of infrastructure keeping the entire city habitable at this scale. And in recent years, the country has gone even further, actively investing in cloud seeding technology, deploying aircraft and increasingly drones to encourage rain from clouds that would otherwise pass over this stretch of desert without releasing much of anything, an active, ongoing intervention in the region's own weather rather than a passive acceptance of whatever rainfall the desert happened to provide naturally. Rashid told me the program had genuinely measurable results in certain conditions. though the exact rainfall increase from any single seeding operation remains difficult to isolate precisely from natural variation, a scientific uncertainty he seemed entirely comfortable sitting with, in a way I found, by that point in the trip, unsurprising. On my last evening, Rashid took me to Old Dubai, along the Dubai Creek, where wooden trading boats called abras still cross the narrow waterway the way they have for generations. Spice souks and gold markets crowding narrow lanes that predate every tower on the skyline visible just a short distance away. The air smelled of cardamom and frankincense. Merchants calling out prices in a mix of Arabic and English to a mixed crowd of tourists and locals doing genuine daily shopping alongside each other. He told me his grandfather's generation had worked this exact waterfront before the pearl trade collapsed and long before oil money transformed the wider economy, and that walking here still felt, to him, like standing at the actual origin point of everything else we'd spent the week looking at. However far removed the gleaming version of the city had since traveled from it. We sat at a small tea stall near the water for a while, watching the abras crisscross the creek in the fading light, the skyline of the newer city visible in the distance behind the older buildings closer to us, both versions of Dubai fully present in the same field of view without either one obviously winning out over the other. I flew home 2 days later. Rashid stayed. Obviously his work is there, in a way that made far more sense to me, having spent a week standing inside its actual subject matter than it ever had from a conference hallway. We talk more since the trip than we did before it, usually circling back, in one form or another, to some version of the same unresolved question neither of us has fully answered: how much of what I treat as an inevitable, ongoing fight with difficult ground is actually a problem that could have been solved more completely, earlier, with the kind of patient, front-loaded engineering the Burj Khalifa's foundation represents, and how much of it genuinely can't be solved that way no matter how much care goes into the design. He emailed me about 6 weeks after I'd landed back in New Orleans with an update from Omar. The strain event from that windy night had been fully incorporated into the building's ongoing monitoring dataset. One more confirmed data point, refining the tower's already extensive record of real-world wind response compared against its original design predictions. Omar had apparently mentioned, in the debrief that followed, that he still felt the weight of that 90-second window every time a similar reading came in since, and that he didn't consider that residual tension a flaw in his own judgment so much as the honest cost of being the person actually responsible for reading a number correctly before anyone else got the chance to double-check it. Rashid also mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd started sending a few of his own team's foundation monitoring reports to me directly, unprompted, saying only that he thought a New Orleans engineer might read them differently than his usual colleagues did, and that he was curious what I'd notice. I don't think the lesson I took from that trip is really about skyscrapers, not only. It's about how easily my own field had trained me to treat difficult ground as a single category requiring a single kind of ongoing, reactive response, rather than recognizing that some ground problems can be solved thoroughly enough, early enough, that the relationship afterward looks genuinely different from the one I fight every day. The Burj Khalifa's foundation isn't magic. And it isn't simply more concrete thrown at a problem until it went away. It's the result of an unusually patient, unusually well-tested design process, willing to spend years and enormous resources getting the initial solution right, specifically so the building wouldn't need constant reactive intervention afterward. Palm Jumeirah, standing a short distance away, is proof that not every problem in the same city gets solved that way, or even can be, and knowing which kind of problem you're actually looking at, before you commit years of resources to solving it one way or the other, might be the single most valuable judgment call in my entire field. What stays with me most isn't the height of the tower or the size of its foundation, honestly. It's the image of Omar cross-referencing 6 sensors in real time at 2 in the morning, correctly reading a single alarming number by placing it inside a much larger pattern rather than reacting to it in isolation. I think about how much of what actually keeps a structure, or a city, or a career safe depends on someone trained well enough to tell the difference between an expected extreme and a genuine anomaly, quickly, under real pressure, without the luxury of waiting for a slower process to confirm what their own judgment already suspected. I think, too, about how many projects back home I've treated as permanently unsolvable simply because the first attempt didn't hold, without ever asking whether a more patient, more thoroughly tested first attempt might have changed that outcome entirely. A short breath before I let you go. If this story changed how you think about what solving a hard engineering problem actually looks like, I'd genuinely like to know which part of it stayed with you. Maybe it's the flower. Maybe it's Omar cross-checking 6 sensors at 2 in the morning. I find myself thinking about both, usually while standing on a job site back home, looking at ground I already know isn't finished moving, wondering what it would take to give it the same patient attention Dubai gave its own sand. Because somewhere in a desert that used to be nothing but sand and total silence, a tower, engineered around the shape of a flower, is standing through another ordinary night of wind, doing exactly what 100 wind tunnel tests said it would do, watched by someone whose entire job is knowing the difference between routine and real. How many of the problems we assume require an endless fight were actually solvable, thoroughly, and in advance, by someone patient enough to test the solution 100 times before ever needing it once? And how would we even recognize that kind of solved problem if we've never once stood inside it, the way I finally did, 4 days into a trip I almost talked myself out of taking? This narrative is told through the perspective of Sophia Marchetti, a fictional geotechnical engineer based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and includes the fictional composite characters Rashid Al-Mazrouei and Omar Nasser. The engineering, historical, and geographic details of Dubai described here, including the Burj Khalifa's buttressed core wind tunnel testing and pile foundation, the region's pre-oil pearl diving economy, Palm Jumeirah's ongoing settlement monitoring, and the UAE's desalination and cloud seeding programs are real and presented as accurately as possible at the time of writing. The specific overnight monitoring event described in this script is a fictionalized composite drawn loosely from the general kind of real-time judgment calls, structural monitoring, engineers are trained to make during extreme wind events, rather than a documented real event tied to any specific date.